went to a normal school and had previously failed his admission tests. Young is confused and amazed, simultaneously at the sight of her destroyed golem, wondering how he had failed his tests. Although the difficulty had been lowered, it was a model used by pros and Jaryong had absolutely annihilated it. He had previously read the moves a few times and countered them. He had baffled researcher Young since. His abilities were above average pros considering bow sense alone. When Jean asks of his assessments, Young states that he hadn't yet reached his limits for her to avail a conclusive result. She is concerned that increasing the difficulty by a level or two would barely help and plan to use output after deactivating the safe mode. But according to the laws, it was a felony to remove the safe mode, with exceptions being the pros. When Jean inquires of what they were ought to, Young is confused since it was a first for her too. While she is considering the chances, a voice speaks up saying it did not pay her for taking troubles but to assess individuals. It was the director of the place, Zeke, the uncle of Jean. He walks in, reminding her brutally that it wasn't hers but her father's facility. Young looks at Jean pitifully since hunters with connections often use the facility and Zeke never did really show up on weekends, making this a total exception. Jaryong, using connection, asking if there was some error since he was now standing still for a while. When Zeke asks of Jaryong, Young excuses him to be a friend of Jean who had failed the previous year's tests, and since the tests were quite expensive, she was helping him out. Zeke, seeing the destroyed golem, he offers to help them assess him by fighting him, although not always, but fights amongst hunters for measurements did take place. When it was difficult finding someone's limits, as such the hunter's levels are a few levels above the test taker. Zeke enters the arena, skipping his introductions, and Jaryong drops in position, quite shocked at the sight of the elf. He did not know of whom he was up against, but his senses alerted him way ahead than his head. It was a first for him. No matter how he looked at the figure before him, he had absolutely no chances of winning. Zeke calls him to charge, asking him to pay no heed to his safety. With a fierce aura enveloping him, Jaryong charges at him. Zeke was Ginseng Group's director of research, Jin's maternal uncle, and Korea's 7th ranker, a white class adventurer. The top hunters or rankers were positioned in a hierarchy of white and followed by black, green, blue, and red. Jaryong charged in him blindly. He did not find a single opening in his whole form and was determined to create one himself. His plan was quite simple: a single strike with his full force behind it. Once the opponent dodged, he'd attack, utilizing the new opening. As he flung his staff at him, Zeke unilaterally blocked it using a single swift movement. Jaryong was terrified as Zeke starts to speak, classifying him as severely frivolous individual than he had thought. He, grabbing his staff, throws a kick at the pit of his stomach. Jaryong is pummeled far across the arena, gasping for breath. Zeke could not understand if he was so idiotic to think such a useless plan. Besides, he had also dropped his weapon. Even though he was conscious, he returns it back to him, stating that he had already overlooked his mistakes twice and would no longer act in leniency, and start swathing himself in aura, warning that any wrong moves would bring him permanent loss of his career. Jaryong wasn't quite sure but understood that he probably had some ill feelings against him, and yet again charges in a full frontal assault, clad in aura body and weapon. Suddenly pauses and starts stabbing at Zeke from a distance, who is a bit impressed at such an approach. Jaryong knew he wasn't stated yet and enforces a huge amount of aura on his staff and starts stabbing even fiercely. Zeke reciprocates to every hit of his, canceling and even overpowering a few. Young is awestruck watching battle amongst a pair of pros, skeptical at how he hadn't passed an admission test. Although he wasn't perfect as a hunter, she does spot a weakness. Jean is certain he was fighting unequal grounds against his Zeke and could not figure out any certain detriments. Zeke throws an acutely rapid punch at Jaryong's face, which he barely avoids. He had now lost the lead and was being consecutively hit. He grits his teeth and swings his staff across, warding him off. Zeke is impressed. He had at least held onto his weapon, but soon after covers him in a barrage of punches. He lands a final one at his stomach and blasts him at the wall behind. He says to be a mobile Jaryong that although he had lost, he had known there were no chances for him to win, although the loss was certain to accept. It would be a predicament. Both Zeke and Young had understood his drawback: he lacked basic training. Although his battle senses were far superior, his basics knowledge of stances, offense, and defense were comparatively inexistent. It was almost as if he had never trained his entire life. Young was quite disappointed looking at his wasteful talent, since a tad bit of training would have honed him way beyond his current leak. Jean is reminded of when Jaryong had said he had never trained his entire life. During their test, Zeke retraces his steps back towards the entrance, speaking he had seen plenty like him. Although he possessed the required talent, had he endeavored some training it would have been different. Although he agrees to a lot in his grades, he suggests him to give up, since relying on his talent solely would get him killed. Jaryong staggeringly awake, speaking that although he was not certain, he was probably trash-talking him, asking if he hated lazy people. Zeke was now astounded. He had intended to finish him off with his final blow. Jaryong says that after the final clash, Maui no longer was focused on the greats but wanted a final bout against him. Determined to show him the results of his efforts, Young, Yeoman, and Jean concerningly insist Jaryong to stop, since the required data had already been received. Zeke seconds their opinion, relaying how pointless any of his further fights would be, and inquires if he wanted to earn his acknowledgement. Jaryong smugly states his extreme frustration, and all he was ought to do was to get beaten by him. But the real reason was something different. Without any guidance, he had started everything from the very bottom, but alongside his natural talent, he managed to overcome the gap of basics, and training his experience in the dungeons too allowed him to dominate the battlefield. Still, irrespective of all of it, he was always humble. He was severely disappointed by the fake adventurers. But Zeke was a different cause. He too was now decisive to beat him down. Until he lost his will and spirit, he was a monster beyond his league. By chancing upon someone so genuine, his blood had started to boil autonomously. Yuni and Jean stare at the now very different pair of adventurers as if two new entities. Jarian breathes out and charges with a frontal assault and swings his staff. As he showers Zeke with blows, an eventual cut shows up on his cheek, shocking Young. As Zeke weaves past the incoming blows, the two assessors notice that although Jirian's hits were crude, there wasn't a single opening amongst them. As he charges with his staff, he recalls of his father and how he tried to sneakily imitate his movements with a broom. Zeke wards the hit with his hand and strikes in his defensively held staff. A small Jarian smiles in his progress. Zeke backs off and charges him with an aura-clad arm. The shy Jarian looks up as his father watches in practice. As Zeke's strike lands, Jarian coldly stares back. He pierces with his staff, his father's hand slowly moving towards him, and ruffles the hair of Koi Jarian. Smiling at the innocent little child of his, the massive blow sends Zeke in a retreating leap. He knew there'd be an opening once he landed, and Zeke knew he could not block an incoming attack. Decisive to reciprocate his efforts, he dives in with his knee, and the two men collide. Young and Jean watch the clash awestruck. As Jarian lay on the cold floor, Zeke walks up, stating he'd have won the bout if he had continued his efforts, but his inept staff strike had lost him. And asked if it was his final mark of pride, Jean wheezes and denies, saying that he had ran out of all his stocked up memories, although he ended up getting battered. It wasn't a bad deal for him. Zeke was infamous amongst the white rankers for his sore attitude, but none could voice any complaints since he had the power to back it up. He heals the bruised up Jarian and retreats towards the exit. He confirms if his name was Yu Jaryang. And as Jean consents, he is glad to have met the son of his acquaintance. Zeke was one of the only 10 white rankers and the greatest healer in Korea. Well, they forgot to mention that's under a factor anyway. As dusk falls, a jacked man pulls up to Zeke, stating how his delays were always. That's it for today. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.